a number that's within the range that the Palestinian Health Ministry was citing. I don't think that everything they say, like Hal said, I don't think that everything they say at the moment the airstrike happens, okay, this is how many people were killed, and we know that for a fact. But broadly, I do tend to trust their numbers as a trend of where the war is going and what's going on in the Gaza Strip. My take.
We got to take a break. More with Hal and Alone when we return. Welcome back in. Panel still standing by. Hal Kempfer, Alon Burstein. There's still much more that I want to get into, including a very important part to this story, the destruction in Gaza. For much of this war, the humanitarian situation in Gaza has been grim, to say the least. An unfathomable amount of people have been displaced, food scarcities, illnesses like polio have emerged, death. Alone, how important is the humanitarian piece of this when we tell the story of the past year?
So obviously it depends, who you ask, right? One of the facets that I often get asked when I'm giving guest lectures at universities is, what do you think is the most misunderstood thing about the war? And what I keep on telling people is the fact that everyone thinks that the thing that's most important to them should be most important to everyone. For a lot of people, the hostages is the most important thing. For some people, the amount of bombs that were dropped is the most important thing. For a lot of people, the humanitarian situation is the most important thing. So first of all, the humanitarian situation drives emotions. It drives emotions, it's driving people. And when we tell the story of the war, whoever's telling that story may very well focus on specifically that facet of the war. And that's understandable. We all find each facet to be the most important one. That said, we have seen the humanitarian situation be one of the crucial facets of how Israel actually tries to run the war because of the international pressure. The humanitarian situation throughout the war has gone through many different phases. However, like you mentioned, after the aid truck incident at the end of February, in which 100 to 120 Palestinians were killed, very controversial what happened. I'll just say, fact is they were killed trying to get to aid trucks. Then the killing of the World Central Kitchen workers. Israel was forced to change the way it ran the war. It was simply forced to change the way it was going to actually allow aid in. In the same way, when Israel invaded Han Yunis, the United States told Israel explicitly, you cannot order an evacuation of all of Han Yunis the way you did in northern Gaza. Why? Humanitarian reasons. All these things have been very influential in the war. And one more point I'll just say, something that's often overlooked because it's looked at maybe as some sort of international joke, but it actually is very important, the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice, much as Israel likes to belittle the influence of the United Nations, Israel really does care. And we can see that in the fact that the International Court of Justice, in response to South Africa's lawsuit, issued injunctions to Israel. And one of them was you cannot withhold any aid from coming into Gaza. Lo and behold, within about a month, Israel's opening up entry points from all over the Gaza Strip, allowing air paradropping missions. This is the same Israel that had a siege on Gaza, wouldn't let any air units come in. All of a sudden, paradropping missions from Jordan, United Arab Emirates are coming in. The story of the humanitarian situation is not only that people care, it has had a big impact on the way the war is run, I would say.
Another important piece to this, the hostages. Let's move to May. By this point, the IDF, which, remember, was working its way south and had made its way, and I'll also just kind of preface this by saying we're going to just kind of continue moving along the timeline here. So we're at May at this point. The IDF, which was working its way south, had made it to basically the southernmost point of Gaza, the city of Rafah, coming into focus. On May 7th, the Israeli army launches a ground offensive in Rafah, where a majority of the territory's civilians had sought shelter. The IDF going into Rafah, destroying battalions, tunnels, and they've since doubled back, ordering evacuations and working through other parts of Gaza again. Where do we stand on the IDF's progress eliminating Hamas, Hal? It seems they've combed nearly the entire strip, killed high-profile figures. A few questions here. Where are the remaining hostages? Where is Hamas's top man, Yahya Sinwar? And how much of Hamas is even left, Hal?
Well, in terms of the as an organized military force, battalion level structure, certainly any brigade level structure or something like that. As of last week, the IDF had said pretty much that's gone. They cannot see any big organized Hamas battalions or anything higher than a battalion there. What that means is they're fighting kind of like a guerrilla force, if you will. I'm not saying you wouldn't find a 100 or a couple of hundred of Hamas fighters in some sort of organized unit, if you will, working an area, but you're just not going to see these big units like they had at the beginning of the war. And the last two battalions that were basically, I hate to say eliminated, basically made combat ineffective, if you will, were in the Rafah area. They did systemically work through it, taking out the Hamas units. And Alon is correct. They didn't go all the way from the north to the south. One of the advantages Israel had is they completely surround this very small territory called Gaza. So therefore, they can bypass certain areas and then come in and flank them. And of course, these are all difficult tactical decisions based on the intelligence at the time. And that's how they prosecuted the war. Now, of course, they got to go back and deal with all these stay behind units, if you will, these guerrilla forces, and that's what they're doing up north, up around Gaza City in the northern part of Gaza right now. Is they're methodically moving, place by place. Now, where are the hostages? Oh, I wish I knew. We don't know. It's been a kind of a guessing game that they were, many of them are being held in tunnels based on the, part of the best intelligence on this is talking to the hostages that were actually released in November. They have a better sense of where they were than anybody else. So, they're getting moved from house to house. They're being held in tunnels. In some cases, they're literally being held in hospitals, which are protected, sites under international law. So, don't know. I honestly, and that's the problem, is I don't think the IDF really has great intelligence. With all the whiz-bang intelligence capabilities, all the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance tools at our disposal, if you have somebody being held underground, 60 feet below ground, there's not a lot that we have that can actually pick up on that person down there. It's human intelligence more often than not. We'll tell you where they are. And then these are tunnels that are booby-trapped and everything. So that's the problem they're having, is where are the hostages? And on Yahya Sinwar, that's a good question. There's still a lot of thought that he may not be with us anymore. There's a lack of communication. There's been reports that he was moving around, but I've never seen a report to say they were having any substantive degree of communication with him. So it's been kind of a question, which is where is Yahya Sinwar? Certainly underground is a pretty safe bet. But with that, if you look at the degradation of command and control of Hamas forces throughout the Gaza Strip, it would indicate that they have a lot of leadership gaps, if you will, that have not been addressed, and that may be that's probably the biggest gap. If he is gone, I'm not, and the IDF and certainly Israel has said they have not assessed that he is dead, although they have not come back and proven that he is still alive. So that's a good question.
So I'd like to, Austin, if it's okay, I just want to add.
I got to ask you, Alon, about the breakdown of the hostage situation, because a number of them we know are confirmed dead, correct?
A number of them are confirmed dead. Can I just add one more thing in response to what Hal said, just adding to that? That was true. Today, though, there were reports in Saudi Arabia, in Al Hadath, and a couple of places that Yahya Sinwar has made contact with the negotiators in Qatar. And in Israel, it was confirmed that that is the current belief, that he, in fact, has made contact. So, again, that doesn't mean that Israel knows, but the current assessments as of a few hours ago are that he is still alive. Otherwise, I completely agree with we don't know where he is, and the leadership gaps, just that was something that just came in a few hours ago. So just adding to that.
And I got to ask, because what is the breakdown of the hostage situation as well? That's perhaps the most important piece to this.
So there are currently still 101 hostages that remain in the Gaza Strip, kidnapped right now a year ago. Of them, 36 are confirmed dead by the IDF. That means that the IDF has gathered enough intelligence to say they are in fact dead, and in negotiations, they are being treated as dead. However, most intelligence estimates that have been published, at least, suggest that at least half of them, if not more, between 50 and 55, are in fact dead. That's already half or more than half. And Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu pretty much confirmed that this is the estimate when he was speaking in a committee in the Knesset 2 weeks ago. He pretty much said, what we're dealing with, what we're negotiating, is for half of the hostages that we estimate are alive. And that is crucial not only for, obviously, the human factor of these individuals who were kidnapped and ended up dying in the Gaza Strip, but more than that, that becomes critical when it comes to hostage negotiations. There is a reason that Hamas has refused to give a list of who is alive and who is dead, because, sorry to be grim, it's a matter of numbers. A live hostage is worth much more, and Hamas is holding the cards very close to their chest to not let Israel know, officially, as far as Hamas knows, is this a body, is not. You can guess Israel all you want. We're not going to divulge who's alive and who's dead, because live hostages are worth more when it comes to exchange for Palestinian prisoners. That's the game.
So let's wrap this up here. Alone, truce talks have been failing recently. This war has no end in sight. How does a war end? And what are the possibilities for this thing coming to a close? The U.S. says that it's in favor of a two-state solution, but we all know that the path to getting there is a complete unknown. In your opinion, and I'll let Hal answer this as well, but let's start with you, Alon. Is there enough public, high-level discussion about how to bring this thing to an end and about what happens afterward?
So I think, and you and I have spoken about this, privately off the air in the past also, I think that there are, there's two different channels that are often discussed, and they rarely meet. One is the sort of macro, what is our agenda? The macro, our agenda could be a two-state solution. For Hamas, it could be a one-state solution in which Israel doesn't exist. For many forces in Israel's government, it could be a one-state solution in which Palestine doesn't exist. Those are macro visions. They have nothing to do with how do we get there, right? The October 7th attack was not going to destroy Israel, much as it did damage. And similarly, Palestinians are not just going to disappear. In the same way, those advocating a two-state solution, okay, what happens to Hamas? In the proposal for the ceasefire and end to the war, there was no talk of what happens after that. It was just a ceasefire and end to the war. Okay, then what? How do you get to a two-state solution? So there are those who focus on the macro vision and say, this is what I want at the end. The process doesn't matter. Then there are those who are sort of married to the process. Those who are saying, okay, I want to do grassroots initiatives in order to create cooperation on the ground. Those who are saying, okay, I want to actually try to work on the ground in order to make sure that the situation improves, however we define improves is, thinking about the process, not really looking at the macro. The problem is those two rarely meet in terms of thinking about also a vision and how do we get to that vision. to give you a more concrete answer, and I'll keep it brief because I don't want to get to hell. To give you a more concrete answer to how does this end, chances are, unless there's some critical juncture that we can't see, Yahya Sinwar, someone in Israel is assassinated, whatever happens, something that radically changes the way the war is going, if it just continues on this trajectory, we're not going to see a one day where it's declared over. We're going to see a muddling down. We're going to see the IDF holding positions in the Gaza Strip, maybe in the Syrian corridor, in the Philadelphia axis. And we're going to see a situation going into a prolonged stalemate. Unfortunately, that is the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict until maybe something changes. Without some sort of critical juncture that changes things, chances are we're just going to see the situation muddling down and staying as it is.
Hal, is there enough chatter going on about the day after plan?
Oh, there's a lot of chatter on the day after plan, but the problem is with anything like an insurgency, these things don't normally just end. There's been a couple of exceptions where there's a grand negotiation. I think of FARC in Colombia. I think of things that happen in El Salvador. There's been a couple of other instances. There is the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. That was a rather unique ending to one of the greatest insurgencies I think the world has ever seen in terms of, well, greatest in terms of it was big. It was horrific, but it was pretty big. I just don't see that here. And this is the problem that Israel has, and this problem that all the countries around Israel have in trying to shape this thing, which is who rules Gaza? Who's going to be there? The reason Hamas was in charge, albeit it was one election and then it was over, never had another one, was a complete lack of confidence in the Palestinian Authority. It just wasn't going to happen. Even in the West Bank, there's a great lack of confidence in the Palestinian Authority. So there's been talk, and of course, Israel is never going to let Hamas rule anything ever again. So what is in there? And there's been talk about some sort of technocratic Palestinian government that could be put in place, that was somewhat neutral in terms of this thing, not influenced by Fatah, not influenced certainly by Hamas or anything of that nature. And nobody's seen what it is. Everybody's been watching for this thing. We're a year into it. We just haven't seen this thing. But what's interesting, and I just want to point this out, and it goes back to your first question, if I may. Why did Hamas do this? Because they're about to get permanently marginalized in the Middle East. If Saudi Arabia had recognized Israel, Hamas is marginalized to a degree that politically it just pulls the rug out from under them. So they felt they had to do the attack. What's interesting is that Saudi Arabia is still leaving that strategic opening, saying, if you can come up with some solution where there's about anything, there's a Palestinian state, they're leaving it pretty broad, we can join in with you. And at that point, you've seen the vision of the Abraham Accords, but you're also seeing a real check against anything you call the axis of resistance or Iranian influence across the region. So I don't know how it'll end, but I do see some glimmer of hope in that the countries around Israel, despite all the harsh rhetoric, despite all the threats of things that they're going to do, those countries that have recognized Israel, allied with Israel, have not cut off relations with them. And Saudi Arabia still leaves the door open towards normalizing relations. And I just think that within that context, something can be achieved. I don't know what it is, but I think something can be achieved.
Hal, Alon, we could go on for hours and hours, I'm sure, but we got to leave it at that for now. Alon, we always look forward to your daily YouTube uploads. We're going to leave it at that. We're going to take a commercial break. More panel when we return. Welcome back into Live Now and our special coverage as we mark the 1-year anniversary of the October 7th attack. As we all know too well, the Israel-Hamas war, it has not been limited to Gaza. Hezbollah and the Houthis have become focuses of the wider conflict as well. We'll talk about Hezbollah later in the night, but for our next panel, I want to focus on the Houthis. Reportedly, in a recent speech, the leader of the rebel group in Yemen proudly announcing that they've targeted 193 ships passing their country and launched more than 1,000 missiles and drones at enemy ships traversing a major international shipping route. All of this in support of Hamas and Hezbollah. It's had a significant impact on the global supply chain, so much so that it got to the point that in January, the U.S. and U.K. got directly involved. They did conduct airstrikes against over a dozen Houthi targets in Yemen, but still, the Houthis to this day continue causing trouble. Hal Kempfer, still with us, and Maritime and Shiano joining in too. Hal, Sal, good to see you. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having us.
So I'll start with you, Sal. The battlefield has spilled into the world's oceans. How disruptive has this been to the global supply chain?
It's been greatly disruptive. What we saw happen early on was a very dramatic attack on board a ship, the Galaxy Leader, back on November 19th, when Houthi used a helicopter assault, still holding the ship and crew hostage. But the attacks on shipping really promulgated a diversion back in December of last year. Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd, two first major container liners, announced that they were going to conduct a diversion all the way around Africa. And what we saw was an elongated supply chain route. And that has resulted in higher shipping costs, more fuel being consumed, and really strapped the global supply chain so that when incidents happen around the world right now, there's not a lot of slack in the system. Saw that just recently with the port strike on the East Coast of the United States, and really demonstrating the vulnerability of our oceanic supply lines.
So Hal, how do the Houthis still continue to cause havoc to this day? Why can't they be stopped? They aren't exactly the beefiest militia, are they?
Well, they're pretty devious. I'll tell you what they are. They're dug in. This is their terrain. They know it. It's very difficult terrain. A lot of high mountains, a lot of compartmented terrain. It's difficult to hit. They've been there for a very long time. They're dug in. When we've done strikes, we've had to bring in a lot of things which are akin to bunker buster type bombs in order to make a significant impression when trying to take out ammunition, such as missiles and even in taking out drones. So it's a little bit difficult. And of course, they have the support of the populace. The Houthis it's a militia group, but it's also a demographic reality is the Houthis, and it's the largely Shiite population within Yemen. So they have, from a lot of perspectives, it's tough to get at them. We have gone in there consistently over and over again, the U.S., the UK, and we'll hit their launch sites. We'll take out their missiles. We'll intercept their missiles at sea. We'll intercept their drones at sea. Interestingly, Israel kind of took a little bit different tack. When they went in there, they said, we're going to take out the supply chain, which I thought was rather interesting. They went after critical maritime infrastructure. They went after a couple of major ports and also went after their oil facilities as well. I thought that was a little bit interesting. I think we could take a page from Israel on that and maybe apply our firepower a little bit differently. But they're very difficult. And if you look at the history of the civil war in Yemen, you look at the history of the Saudi involvement in that civil war, what you see is they're very difficult to root out. And the terrain is just, I'll just put it this way, it's non-permissive. It's tough terrain, and they're very well established.
So Sal, I know you have sources. What is it like for mariners that traverse the Red Sea at this point?
It's been treacherous the entire time. I mean, we've seen attacks against vessels. As you mentioned, we're seeing over 100 attacks against ships. Some of these attacks are indiscriminate. The Houthi want to say that they're attacking vessels directly connected to Israel, yet we know from the data only about 30% of the ships actually have any connection at all to Israel. So that means that if you're sailing on a ship that's, identifying itself as not being aligned with Israel at all, nothing to do with it, doesn't make you safe from the Houthi attack. So it raises a level of concern on board the ships. We've seen out of those 100 and so ships attacked, 2 of them have been sunk. We've had 4 merchant mariners killed, 3 from the Philippines, 1 from Vietnam. Several others have been injured. And what this has done is escalated the cost to do business. We've seen the escalation of war risk insurance, and it's caused for mariners a lot of anger. They can't really do much about this. Most mariners who sail are from countries like the Philippines, India, China, Indonesia, and Russia and Ukraine. They really can't choose what ships they sail on, so they have to take the jobs that's available. And sometimes that involves sailing through the Red Sea and coming under these attacks. And these attacks can come in almost any form. We've seen cruise missiles, we've seen ballistic missiles, we've seen unmanned surface vessels. We've also seen boardings by the Houthi, at different times. We've seen pirate attacks, renewed piracy off the coast of Somalia. So it's just a multi-level attack, and it's really causes a lot of stress and concern for shippers. And remember, we've lost a lot of shippers after COVID. We haven't quite returned to the normal level of mariners out there, and this just adds another level to it.
Yeah, so how does this change their standard operating procedure when they're moving through that exact region? What's different now versus a year ago?
Well, we've seen the addition of onboard security detachments. We've seen that come in back during the Somali pirate crisis. However, onboard security detachments, 2 or 3 people with some long rifles may work to deter a, armed boarding party of Somalis, but it doesn't really work against a cruise missile, doesn't work against a ballistic missile. And as we saw in the most recent video, an attack on a in ballast tanker heading northbound in the Red Sea, even with their armed security detachment, didn't stop an uncrewed surface vessel from coming in. And what we've seen is when the Houthis really want to target vessels, they will launch multiple attacks against it. The ship you're showing there, Union, was subjected to one of those unmanned surface vessel attacks and then boarded on 2 separate occasions by the Houthis, who set demolition charges on the ship and caused the vessel to go on fire. The ship had been burning in the Red Sea for over a month. Fires have just been extinguished on board that vessel.
Al, how do the Houthis get their weapons? I'm assuming Iran, but while we're talking about global shipping patterns, is there no way to prevent the Houthis from replenishing their supplies?
Well, you assume correct. It is Iran. That's where they're getting their weapons from. They've been stocking up weapons for a very long time. That's one of the things the Iranians, the Al-Quds force did was they front loaded a lot of these missiles, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, some of the USV, unmanned surface vessel attacks, literally taking a page from what the success that has been seen by the Ukrainians in the Black Sea. And of course, drones and lots of drones. So they've been very successful in bringing these in. That's where the Israelis kind of differentiate from us. We went in and we started hitting, launch sites where they keep ammunition, or I should say munitions like ballistic missiles and drones and things like that, and cruise missiles as well. And the Israelis actually went in there and started doing supply chain interception. Now, we've been trying to, and I think we have been, improving our intelligence. Sal can talk to this. It's a very busy waterway. I mean, there are a lot of ships, a lot of dhows and everything else that can be used to bring in stuff. So you can't, it's impossible to stop every ship and search it. You can't do that. But what you have to do is you have to figure out different means. Some of it's analytical means, looking at what's out there to figure out which ship might be bringing in stuff, and then selectively going in there and trying to go after that. And in that, we've had some success, not as much success. Of course, the issue is really if there is one silver lining here, they really can only be supplied by sea. You can do a little bit by air. It's very difficult, but really it's by sea. They can't do over land. That's all controlled. All the borders are controlled. Not saying the borders aren't a little porous in areas, but they are controlled. So it's really the sea lane. So on the one hand, it's an opportunity to put in a more effective interdiction plan. On the other hand, there's so much maritime traffic in that area it's very difficult to stop it all from coming in.
To Hal's point, Sal, what type of goods are typically shipped through that route, and what nations are the ones that use that route primarily?
Well, I mean, we saw prior to the attacks about 15% of the world's shipping went through that route. So we're talking about one of the major choke points in the world. And even though that's a route between Europe and Asia, and you would think those are the two main nations, about 30% of the cargo that was going to Europe actually got transloaded and headed over to the United States. The way we do shipping now is this big kind of hub and spoke method where goods move throughout these large transshipment points. And so when the Houthis decided to start attacking vessels, they started interdicting trade for everyone. It's very easy to sit there and say this is a European problem, this is an Asian problem, but this is a global problem. This is an attack on the freedom of the seas. And this is something that since the end of World War II, the United States and its allies have really ascertained and sat there and said, this is going to be unchallenged. We're not going to refuse this level of commerce. It's what's given us really the world economy we're in today. And what we've seen now for almost a year is the Houthis have been able to really interdict the flow of about 10% of the world trade. A lot of large vessels, really any ship that's in value over more than 100 million, will take the diversion around Africa because of the war risk. And this is what's really the most insidious thing about the Houthis is the Houthis don't have to be accurate. They don't have to hit vessels. They don't have to target. It's just merely the threat of the attack is enough to send ships routing around Africa, because many of these ships are registered in countries like Panama, Liberia, and the Marshall Islands. They don't have defenses to really protect them. And so it really falls upon the United States, its allies, the European Union to do this. Unfortunately, the U.S. has other obligations. Its focus has shifted to defending Israel and dealing with Iran. That has led the effort shift over to the European Union, who just don't have the resources and assets to provide the protection for shipping going through. So unfortunately, we're going to keep seeing this diversion take place.
Hal, if a ceasefire is achieved, do we assume that the Houthis calm down?
Maybe. They did in November. And that's one of the things we saw. If there's a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, although with that said, the war has expanded so much since November. I can't really, I don't have a crystal ball that will tell me what exactly the Houthis will do. But in November, during the ceasefire, the Houthis did pretty much observe, as did Hezbollah, as did other Iranian-backed, proxies or militias, the ceasefire terms. So possibly, yes. I will say one thing, though. The world is awakened to the threat, the maritime threat that the Houthis pose. The world is also calculating the cost of what this is. As Sal alludes to, when they go around Africa, that is adding two or 3 weeks, depending on what that is. And then, of course, the transshipment across the Pacific to do it another way in the intermodal world we live in. And then, of course, one thing that Sal knows this much better than I do is the challenge. Of course, Mother Nature wasn't on our side on this either, because the other big canal, not the Suez Canal, but the Panama Canal, was running out of water. So they had to actually decrease the number of ships that could do Panama Canal crossings because of a water shortage. All of this kind of accumulated to cause huge problems in the global supply chain, if you will, across the board. And I don't know that we can sit back quietly and not deal with the Houthi threat. I think there's going to be something going on there that's going to go well past whatever happens, whatever's going on in Gaza. Dealing with the Houthi maritime threat is something that the entire world is focused on.
So, Sal, before we go, let's say the Houthis, and by the way, what we're looking at there is video of the tanker. Let's say the Houthis don't stop anytime soon, Sal. Can the world's supply chain be malleable for this for much longer? Like, can they deal with this for an extended period of time? What do you say?
Well, I think shipping has always shown that it can adapt and change. I mean, we've seen the closure of the Suez Canal for a year in 1956. We saw it close for 8 years in 1968. We can definitely see shipping accustomed to, change to it. The problem is that usually comes with a cost. And it also comes with the issue that if something else happens, there's not a lot of reserve, a lot of slack in the system to take it up. And I think the fear we have right now is that the Iranians using the Houthi to manipulate shipping have demonstrated that small regional powers can play an inordinate role against global shipping. And what players are out there next? Is there somebody in the South China Sea, in the Malacca Straits, off the coast of Panama, off Hezbollah in the Eastern Mediterranean by Suez? Those are areas we have to be concerned about. So I think the geopolitical aspects of shipping are really flashing red for a lot of people. There's a lot of concern out there in where the next area is going to come. And a nation like Iran or Russia or China or any other nation out there can really get a proxy going and start interdicting trade, and how vulnerable our shipping actually is.
All right. Hal, Sal, we appreciate your time. We're going to leave it there for now. We're going to take a commercial break. More panel when we return. All right, welcome back in Alive Now. I'm Austin Westfall. We, of course, can't forget about the Iran connection here, the Hezbollah connection here. We've been talking so far largely about Gaza and about the Houthis, but since basically the beginning of this war, Hezbollah's tit for tat with the IDF along the Israel-Lebanon border has been a side story to the conflict in Gaza. But as of late, it's kind of become the main focus of our coverage. In recent weeks, the IDF eliminating a lot of top Hezbollah figures, including their top guy, Hassan Nasrallah. That came alongside a stunning attack in which Israel detonated personal pagers and walkie-talkies that were carried by Hezbollah members and affiliates. Hezbollah is an Iran-backed group, just like Hamas and the Houthis, and Behnam Ben Tailblue is an expert on Iranian security and political issues. He's also a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Hal Kempfer rounding out our coverage for the evening as well. So it's good to see both of you. Thank you for coming on, Behnam. I want to zoom out and think bigger picture here for a moment, because we've been talking about Hezbollah. I've talked with you on air about Hezbollah multiple times in recent weeks. My question is this. You and I have discussed this before. At this point, is it possible that Hezbollah is even capable of a war with Israel? How much have their forces been destroyed in recent weeks?
It's a pleasure to be with you, gentlemen. Thanks for having me. And it's a critical question because it's one that the IDF is using to assess its next move, both via air and via ground, against the Iran-backed proxy in Lebanon. Make no mistake, Hezbollah has always shown an ability to kind of exploit the chaos, just like its patronage Tehran has always often been able to better manage the chaos than us or the Israelis in a particular theater. Based on public reports, some of those reports have made their way into the New York Times using Israeli figures. Almost 60%, according to these reports, of that arsenal of unmanned aerial threats. That on the low end, it includes mortars. On the mid-tier, includes rockets and drones, IRAMs as well, anti-tank weapons. And on the higher tier, PGMs, precision guided missiles, and even reportedly some ballistic missiles. We don't know what ratio of this 200,000 plus arsenal, that 60% includes, that has been captured or eviscerated on the battlefield. But nonetheless, this is a key priority, as well as kind of gutting the command and control of Lebanese Hezbollah to make sure they can do what you ask, which is to be able to respond, to be able to regroup, to be able to live to fight another day.
So the big concern here has always been since October 7th that some sort of wider war might break out. Hal, I'll bounce the question off of you as well. If there was such a thing to happen, what is Hezbollah capable of at this point?
Well, Hezbollah is not capable of any significant offensive action at this point. They didn't have a large mechanized force. They couldn't do a lot by ground. They don't have an air force to speak of. What they have are missiles. They have missiles. They have indirect fire. You got mortars. Artillery to some extent, not much, but mostly with various different types of missile systems, all the way up from very tactical up to ballistic missiles. And the problem they have right now is, first off, most of that force has been destroyed, and as Ben mentioned. And the other problem is that command and control. You know, they've had a series of strikes taking out their top leaders, not only taking out their top leaders, but also taking out the reportedly the leader of Al-Quds force may have been taken out, who would happen to be in Beirut, and also, of course, one of the top IRGC leaders, Brigadier General, that was there. So they've taken out all these leaders. They did the pager attack, which took out this whole strata of leadership. Took out a communications path, took out the walkie-talkies. Now everybody's staring at their electrical appliances in their homes cautiously because of that. But it makes a very difficult ability to command and control, because you can't communicate. Not only you can't communicate, the folks you would have communicated with aren't there. And what I would bring out with Hezbollah, they're not a big up and out organization. The top leaders have been there for decades. They're not an organization that changes over top leadership or even mid-level leadership really that fast. And I think that's going to be a big problem for them, which is when you have a decapitation strike throughout all the ranks like this, plus the decimation, the destruction on the ground. I'm not sure exactly, aside from just basically defending in place, I'm not quite sure what they can manifest at this point.
So we're looking at a live picture at Haifa right now. It's a community in northern Israel. We have another live look, and we look at this image regularly around this time of night. This is a live image of the Beirut metro. It's not uncommon as of late to see IDF activity taking place in real time. Sometimes we see live strikes taking place in the Beirut metro. Benham, I got to ask you, did Hamas's attack on October 7th, basically in an indirect way, give Israel an excuse to take a shot at crushing Hezbollah?
Well, it's a great question, because the Israelis were asking themselves this between the end of the Hamas terrorist attack on October 7th and when they commenced military operations against Gaza days later. There was reportedly a debate as to in what direction should the IDF and IAF go. Should they go south first to deal with this issue, this particular proxy of the Islamic Republic, the lowest of the low of the axis of resistance? Or would this be an opportunity to be able to move from problem managing to problem solving? And indeed, even though the Israelis first went towards Gaza, built up the support for pushing back against the Iran-backed network there, and had some impressive successes via air and via ground, ultimately it was Hezbollah that made that choice for them by continuing to widen the war, to use different munitions, to fire at different targets, and to fire from and at different geographies. So Hezbollah widened the war. It was the first proxy of Iran to enter. While bodies were still being counted on October 8th, there was fire from the north. And incrementally, Hezbollah put itself into the position that it finds itself today. So while the Israelis did make that philosophical move from manager to solver, because of the ferocity and the horrific nature of the October 7th terrorist attack, the steady stream of fire that the Israelis were not able, through standard and much more conventional means, were not able to knock off. That actually has ended up allowing the Israelis to deliver this very, very powerful, I don't want to call it a death blow yet, because you never know with the Middle East, things can always get worse, not better, but allow Israel to really gain the advantage through this kind of calculated escalation and go after command and control and elements of its arsenal. So in a sense, Hezbollah's ability to stay in the fight tactically may have opened the door for an Israeli strategic win here if followed through.
Right now we're looking at video from about a week ago. We saw these images live on our air as Iran took a direct strike at Israel. April, though, is when we first saw Iran target Israel directly instead of its proxies. So it went with its own ballistic missiles and drones instead of going through its normal channels. The second one, as I mentioned, it just happened on October 1st. So I'll ask you about both of these attacks at the same time. They both share a lot of similarities, don't they? Both happened in retaliation for Israel killing high-profile figures in Iran. Both times, Iran took their shot at Israel, and basically nothing came of it. The missiles were shot down, or they simply didn't make it. What did we learn about Iran's capabilities from these two events, Hal? And maybe another important question is, did Iran learn anything about Israel's defensive capabilities in the process?
Well, they did, actually. If you look at what they did the second time, the more recent attack, October 1st, one of the things they did is they concentrated their ballistic missiles into one, a lot of them, not all of them, but they concentrated a lot of them in a central area of Israel with the idea that they could overwhelm the Iron Dome defenses. It was an interesting idea. Didn't work out as well as they hoped, but some of the warheads did get through. Of course, some of the warheads get through because they get knocked off course, but warheads are warheads. They're going to land somewhere. And but they did get through. They did cause some damage. One of them actually literally landed 500 meters from the headquarters of Mossad. So that's a pretty accurate missile, although it's probably knocked a little bit off course, I think. But with that said, they did learn some things. They didn't use the drones. They learned that. That was a little bit different. But one of the things we've all learned is that despite all the, certainly the I would say almost overbearing, the rhetoric that comes out of Tehran, threatening that they're going to do these, overwhelming attacks that nobody can possibly resist. The simple reality, the battle space reality is that this is really what they have. This is what they can launch. And as of right now, it doesn't seem to be able to overcome Israeli defenses. And in fact, if you look at it, it's somewhat embarrassing for Iran because they've done two big attacks. They've launched, as near as we can tell, everything that they could have launched that could range Israel in these attacks, and they just didn't have much effect. And so this is having a huge impact, not to some extent militarily, probably to a bigger extent politically on Iran. That everybody looks at Iran and they say, I'm not sure they can really back up what they're saying. And now, of course, you see what's going on in Hezbollah with Hezbollah to the north. This all has a kind of a cumulative impact on the perception of Iran and its axis of resistance around the region.
So I want to just kind of ask about the response to this attack, because we're still waiting for Israel's response to Iran, aren't we? The goal, and I'm just going to work in a hypothetical here, Benham, is the goal going to be to pack a punch from the Israeli perspective? Do they want to pack a punch in their response, yet not so much of a punch that it'll escalate things further? That is what they did during the initial attack back in April, correct?
Well, back in April, indeed, the Israelis launched a direct but unattributed or unclaimed strike on an Iranian radar facility. It was allegedly part of the radar for the S-300 Russian advanced surface-to-air missile defense system that was guarding or forward deployed to guard a nuclear facility in the area, as well as near a military base area as well. But ultimately, the Israelis proved, in contrast to the April 13, April 14 strike, that they could do much more damage with much less ordnances and with much less munitions, because simply they had that much more battle space capability and lethality to bring to bear, a sharp contrast to the large barrage but limited effect of the Islamic Republic back in April. I do think, though, that there were a lot of political constraints on the Israeli decision back in April 19th, and there will still be a lot of political constraints on those decisions today. I think one reason why you may have had the CENTCOM commander travel there recently, one reason why you may have even had not the strike materialize so far, or at least the date we think is now 5 or 6 days out, is because the Israelis are trying to meet and match some of these American red lines. While President Biden has talked about Israel's right to defend itself and indeed hinted that a response would be coming, he's also talked against or counseled against going after Iran's nuclear program and even counseled against going after the Islamic Republic's oil and energy facilities as well. So Israel may be trying to land a deterrent punch while staying within those U.S. red lines. The converse is, at least within the Israeli military establishment, what is the goal here? Is this deterrence by punishment? Is this defanging? Is this decapitation? And in terms of how many times this has to happen, because lest we forget, the Islamic Republic has made history now 3 times in 2024. 3 times in 2024, a non-nuclear weapon state has conventionally, directly, and from its own territory attacked nuclear weapon state. Pakistan once in January, and Israel twice, once in April and once in October. And this has not happened in history ever. The United States and the Soviet Union have never done this. And the Islamic Republic 3 times later is still standing and living to tell the tale. So there's a huge deterrence issue there. And so for the Israelis, they have to figure out, is this going to be an operation or is this going to be a campaign? And then the X factor for the Iranians is, did they escalate to de-escalate? Did they want to simply land a blow to touch the Israelis but stand back? How much of this is more political versus military for them? And ultimately, are they counting on this thing that we've seen out of the White House now, quite literally 1 year and counting since the October 7 terrorist attack, which is, despite America's talk about deterrence in the region, when push comes to shove, they opt for de-escalation. And ironically, the Islamic Republic, an adversary of America, may be counting on America to restrain its own ally in the region, Israel.
Okay, guys, so where do we go from here? I think we can all agree that neither Iran nor Israel want a full-scale war to break out. That's in nobody's interest. But when we see missiles flying from Iran to Israel, it scares the world. Does this all boil back down to the Israel-Hamas war negotiations? Do Israel, Hamas, and mediators like the U.S., Qatar, and Egypt need to get a truce done, release the hostages, and stop the fighting? Is that where the wider de-escalation has to begin, Behnam?
In my estimation, that's where many would like it to begin, but also in my estimation, and I'm a much better watcher of Iranian domestic politics than Israeli domestic politics, so you have to forgive me for pontificating here, but from what I can detect from far away, Likud is more popular. Benjamin Netanyahu is more popular now than before. Certainly more popular now than during the height of the judicial reform protest that predated the October 7 terrorist attack. And actually now there is more of a shift within that society, despite the hostage issue being a major electric and political rod socially in that country as well as politically. There still really is a support for that move from problem manager to problem solver, and that the people who lived on the periphery of Gaza in the south and who live on the northern front vis-a-vis Lebanese Hezbollah simply cannot go back to business as normal. And another, deconfliction agreement that locks Hamas or Hezbollah back into place means that there'll be yet another boom and bust cycle of violence that another generation of Israelis will have to endure. And I think that's where the popular support for actually doing more than just pushing back and containing this terrorist threat, but actually trying to defeat it will come. And in that sense, those who I think are trying to foist the political handcuffs onto this war may be missing that demographic and political reality within Israel. And then second, they miss Iran's strategy here. Iran's strategy is to continue a death by 1,000 cuts using all these proxies against Israel and never actually have to pay a price. I mean, in one sense, I respectfully disagree, Austin, because I think the Islamic Republic's success strategy in the past 2 decades against us, against the Israelis, against what's left of the pro-American order in the Middle East has been to deny for everybody a limited war option while enabling for itself and for its proxies a limited war option. So to some degree, they actually do seek conflict, but they seek to be able to exploit conflict within the political parameters where they can get away with it, or there can be no attribution, or there won't be any kind of kinetic retaliation.
Hal, I'll end it with you. Even if, hypothetically, the Israel-Hamas war comes to a ceasefire, there is still an uncomfortable question that we must face. How do you eliminate the terrorist problem? You can kill as many Hamas and Hezbollah terrorists as you want, but that doesn't necessarily eliminate the ideas that the organizations represent. There are a lot of angry people living and growing up in an active war zone today. Do people talk enough about the long-term terrorist problem?
Well, I think they do, and I think there's some things we can look at from the, if you will, the war on terror. And as you know, I'm a veteran of the war on terror. Multiple trips to the Middle East, extended trips, shall we say, dealing with that issue. And with that, look at ISIS. All right, they pushed out very quickly. They took a lot of terrain. They had what they called a caliphate, which was they had their own little national state, which at one time they actually controlled more terrain in terms of space than the size of Great Britain. That's pretty impressive considering from whence they came. Now, big push, pushed them back, basically destroyed them as, shall we say, a real estate organization. But ISIS still exists, still doing terrorist type stuff, lower level stuff in and around Syria and Iraq. Another branch has taken off, of course, ISIS-K doing terrorist attacks, but they're not as big. And we have seen this in the past that these things will blow up. We push them back. And I hate to say it almost gets down to I don't want to say a manageable level of terrorism, but you get a lower level of terrorism. And really what you have to do is it becomes constant. And those who work terrorism will tell you it is a constant ongoing thing. You never stop. You never declare victory. You're constantly looking. And by the way, if you take out Hezbollah as an organization, hold your breath, count to 3. There'll be another Shiite extremist organization pop up somewhere else with a slightly different name, and it will want to do terrorism. And we're going to see the same thing. Even if Hamas is wiped out as an organization, we're going to see something that will take up that mantra. So it never quite stops. If I could just mention one thing, though, Benham, you brought up a great point. One of the things I do think that Israel will do, and I don't know when they're going to do it. I'm not holding my breath on any ceasefire thing happening real soon. But I do, any type of major strike operation, you got to take out their air defense capabilities. And there's a rather interesting strategic option that Israel has, and they've proven that already with that strike in April. They can get in there and they can take out the radars and they can take out the air defense missiles. And if they were to do what we call destruction of enemy air defense, DEAD, yes, it does sound like dead. If they were to do that on a large scale, they would leave essentially Iran open. And I think certainly with Netanyahu's overture to Iran, he is trying to separate the Iranian people from the government. That vulnerability, that strategic vulnerability has a certain psychological element. I am sure that is being discussed in Israel right now, is doing that and then leaving a series of things opened to see if maybe they can kickstart something inside Iran. I would not be surprised. In fact, I would be very surprised if they weren't discussing that.
That sound about right to you, Benham?
Well, actually, on this bit about the air defense, given that the last time they claimed an air defense, they struck but did not claim a single air defense radar. I think now if they go after the vast majority of them, Iran has nowhere near Israel's layered air and missile defense system, but it does have a patchwork of foreign procured and domestically put together SAMs. If they go after the mother load of those facilities, the surface to air missiles, the radars, even if they do one step short of what Hal said, which is the suppression of the enemy air defenses, just to induce that shock, and then politically they go out there and they own it, they say we did it, there's some kind of video or some kind of press release, that could have a ripple effect too. We simply don't know. I mean, here, I'll tell you this interesting point about Iranian nationalism. Back in the late 1990s, the U.S. and Iran played a soccer match with each other during the World Cup. And the vast majority of dissident and diaspora Iranians still supported the national team. In the most recent World Cup, in the one in Qatar, I believe in the 2022, in the fall winter, if I'm not mistaken, you had the same thing. The U.S. and the Iranians play a match during the tail end of that World Cup. But this time you had the vast majority of dissidents and diaspora and even Iranians domestically trash the home team. So this goes to show you how sticky this issue is, that the Islamic Republic of Iran is a poor guardian of the Iranian national interest. And it's just as this regime has defined itself in terms of Islamism rather than nationalism, and the population nationalism rather than Islamism, that gives the Israelis a political tool rather than just a military tool. And I would stress it's important not to squander that political tool. And I think creative ideas like what Hal mentioned are ways to be able to capitalize on those political tools.
We appreciate both of you tonight. We'll talk with you both very soon, I'm sure. Take care. Have a good rest of your night.
All right. Thank you.
Good night, Austin.
I hope you enjoyed our round of panels tonight. We are going to be wrapping up our Israel-Hamas coverage today, marking 1 year since the conflict started. We're starting to see that the sun is rising. Some of our live images. This is our live look at Beirut. Not uncommon that we see black smoke, airstrikes, things of that nature around this time of morning. Doesn't appear that there's any activity today. We got a live look at Jerusalem where the sun is rising, Tel Aviv as well, and finally, I believe this is Haifa, the northern Israeli community that's felt the brunt of so many Hezbollah missile threats. We're going to take a commercial break. We'll be right back.
Welcome back, everyone. Here live now from Fox as we continue to track the very latest Hurricane Milton as it gets closer to Florida. Governor Ron DeSantis giving the latest updates. Let's listen in.
Of 3 o'clock, Milton has strengthened not just into a major hurricane, but a Category 5 hurricane, and not just a Category 5 hurricane, but a very strong 175 mile per hour sustained wind. Category 5 hurricane. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty about what is going to happen in terms of this track. It is predicted that this will weaken, but it was not predicted that it would get this strong to begin with. So we can hope and pray that it does weaken. But as of right now, this is a ferocious hurricane. It is currently a little less than 700 miles southwest of Tampa. Storm surge watch has been issued for the Florida Gulf Coast from mainland Monroe County to the Dixie-Levy County line. Possibility of 8 to 12 feet of storm surge is forecast from the Anclote River to Englewood, including Tampa Bay. 5 to 10 foot peak storm surges forecast from Yankeetown southward to the Anclote River and from Englewood southward to Bonita Beach, including Charlotte Harbor. And those numbers can change and they can go up in certain areas depending on how the storm ultimately approaches the Florida Peninsula. Hurricane watches have been issued for portions of west central Florida and the Nature Coast. Tropical storm watches extend further south and north through southwest Florida and the Keys and along northern Florida. The Florida Division of Emergency Management is actively addressing storm-related resource requests. They're currently in the process of fulfilling 850 missions. They've deployed everything from sandbags to shelf-stable meals to tens of thousands of water bottles to thousands of tarps. We've already sent truckloads of food and water to Central Florida in preparation for points of distribution site subsequent to the storm hitting. We're also coordinating the deployment of more than 2,000 feet of flood protection systems and prioritizing critical infrastructure like hospitals, wastewater treatment facilities, and electrical infrastructure. We have generators deployed to support special needs sheltering. We also have Starlinks deployed in areas that have asked for that. More than 200 ambulances and more than 30 paratransits are in Central Florida, ready to support first responder operations as appropriate. State of Florida is amassing fuel reserves ahead of Milton and staging it to be utilized as needed. Those quantities include 415,000 gallons of diesel, 389,000 gallons of gasoline, and there is, as I mentioned this morning, an additional 1.5 million gallons of both diesel and gasoline that are en route to the state. Now, there is currently no fuel shortage in the state of Florida. Fuel continues to arrive at Florida ports. However, there are long lines at some gas stations, and because you've had a run on gas, there have been gas stations that have run out of fuel, but they are being resupplied with the fuel. So we're going to continue to ensure that we have fuel coming, but they're still coming with the ports. We have some coming on the ground, so people can go. You may be in a line, but if your gas station runs out, there's going to be more fuel on the way. As I've mentioned, we have ramped up support for county debris removal operations. We're working this mission to supplement their mission 24/7 around the clock, and we're going to continue to do that all the way until it is no longer safe to do so. Please, local officials, these vendors, there's been vendors that they don't necessarily do, and then when there's some sunlight and people see they're not doing, then they start to work really hard. We got to get as much of this taken care of as possible. I know with Kevin and with Jared putting the state assets to supplement, it has made a really significant difference. We want to continue to do that. Those barrier islands like Pinellas, Manatee that are under evacuation orders, people obviously should heed those. But once that deadline passes, we're still going to have the debris removal operations ongoing all the way until we start to hit tropical storm force winds. So that's all the rest of today through the night, all day tomorrow, most likely into the beginning of Wednesday morning. So I appreciate all the effort that's gone into that on the state. We have deployed just on the state side to assist with the federal, with the local debris mission, over 300 dump trucks to help with debris. And in the last 36 hours, state assets have been able to do 12,000 cubic yards of debris removed from communities and brought to landfill. That's 663 total loads. So that's been a good mobilization. It will make a difference, but we need to keep doing that to mitigate the harm that could happen once the storm goes. Florida National Guard, State Guard, additional FDOT personnel, and Florida Highway Patrol are all engaged in that debris mission. For the storm, we have 5,000 National Guardsmen that have been mobilized, and we will have, before the storm hits, another 3,000 National Guardsmen that will be on duty. We're also deploying major